Let's talk a little bit about the attack on Pearl Harbor, referred to by Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the date that will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941. There's a couple different days in our nation's history that I think are pretty relevant, and this is one of them, December 7th, 1941, where really the course of our nation changes significantly. Prior to December 7th, the United States really had tried and had wanted to stay out of the war. It is Pearl Harbor that decisively brings us in. December 7th, 1941 was a Sunday, and that attack was planned on that day on purpose. The Japanese were fully aware that, customarily on Sunday, people in the United States were not working. We were not at a high state of readiness. We were at church, we were sleeping in, we were on the golf course, we were taking the day off. We were not active, and they knew the base would be quiet. They knew that most people wouldn't be there, so they knew that we wouldn't put up an effective resistance. And so the attack actually begins on Sunday morning at 7:55 in the morning. We should have been better prepared than we were. We had received ample warnings that an attack was imminent. We knew, for instance, we'd been listening to the Japanese diplomatic code, and we'd broken it several months earlier, and we knew that they were asking for berthing information from Pearl Harbor, from a spy in Pearl Harbor, and we let it go. We knew who the spy was. He was a dentist who had an office that overlooked the harbor. And berthing information, a berth is where a ship parks. And so prior to the attack, they'd been asking, periodically, but the week or two prior to the attack, the requests became daily, and they became much more specific. Not only which ships were in the harbor, but where were they at in the harbor? And so this should have been a red flag that they were definitely planning something that required a lot of detail about where our ships were. Further, we know that we could see, just if walking out down the street in Washington, D.C., their diplomats have been burning documents nonstop. And that's a telltale sign that you're getting ready to go to war. You know that there's sensitive documents that you don't want to fall into the hands of the enemy once the war begins, and so you destroy them. And we do the same thing. It's a well-known and established practice. And we knew that the Japanese had been burning documents for some time. So again, we should have known war was imminent. Further, because we had been listening to the Japanese diplomatic code, we knew that the government had asked the Japanese ambassador to carry on talks so that America might not become suspicious. Well, suspicious of what exactly? This should have again been throwing up red flags everywhere. And further, we had intercepted a message on December 6th that they were to go ahead and break off diplomatic relations because further talks seemed unnecessary and seemed useless. So we knew they were ready to break diplomatic relations. Japan had a track record of this. When they came to an impasse, they would cut off negotiations, and the very next day, within 24 to 48 hours, they would launch a sneak attack before the declaration of war. So again, we should have known this was coming. And in fact, we did suspect some attack was coming. We just didn't expect what came. The attack itself, why did we not expect it? Well, because the attack was massive. It was 6 Japanese carriers, 183 airplanes in the first wave. We just didn't think they could sneak a fleet that size across the Pacific. We thought we would see it coming a mile away, but we didn't. And so we didn't prepare for an attack that was this massive. Like I said, the attack 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, 183 airplanes in the first wave. The second wave consisted of 170 planes, and let me go ahead and say this right now. Those are the same planes. The Japanese attack, their planes come back, they land, they rearm, they refuel, they take off again, and come back again to get us again. The Japanese didn't only include airplanes in their attacks, they also attempted to get into the harbor using midget subs that were launched from other submarines. These proved to be unsuccessful. Most of them were never found. One, I believe, did wash up on shore in Hawaii with the crew dead, and the others just were lost to the Pacific Ocean, never to be seen again. The one that we sunk was 6:45, so this is a good hour and 10 minutes before the air attack begins, and we sank it because there was a destroyer that had been out taking target practice that morning, and the way they do that is they would tow a tow ship would tow a skiff behind it, and the destroyer would come out and take shots at this skiff that was being towed so their gunners could practice. And they were coming back into the harbor, and Pearl Harbor was protected by submarine nets. And so in order for our ships to come through, they'd have to go ahead and pull the submarine nets back. And so what this little mini sub did was it got right in between that tow ship and the skiff, or in the sled that was being pulled. And the destroyers saw this. They saw its periscope, and they're like, "That's a submarine." So they took a run. They depth charged it, and sure enough, up came oil and stuff like that. And they radioed back, "Hey, we just sunk a submarine trying to sneak into the harbor." And he was a young guy, a young commanding officer, and so all the guys are there. They just didn't believe it. They thought, "Oh, he depth charged a whale," which that stuff did happen. They'd mistake whales for submarines and this and that. But in this case, no, he was right. He actually did sink a submarine. The attack itself concentrated on Ford Island. That's the island right in the middle of Pearl Harbor till this day. And the reason it concentrated on that particular location was because that's where all of our battleships were berthed, where they were parked. And the damages were massive. Initially, of the battleships that were hit, they were the main targets. The Arizona, which is still on the bottom of Pearl Harbor today, was a total loss. 1,000 men lost their lives. It was a direct hit. A bomb fell directly into the ship's magazine, which the magazine is where they keep all of their gunpowder. And the reports from the day state that when the explosion happened, that it actually lifted the entire battleship 2 to 3 feet out of the water. The force of the explosion was so massive, and it sank immediately. The Oklahoma was hit on the side by torpedoes, and it began to flood, and it tipped over, and it actually the entire superstructure, the tall parts of the battleship, got ripped off on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. And most people don't realize that the guns on a battleship actually aren't attached to the battleship; they're just set in the battleship. And so when the battleship capsizes, the guns actually fall out, and that happened to the Oklahoma. The West Virginia was hit in a similar fashion, but thanks to the crew acting very, very quickly, when they realized they were listing, they were tilting over, they started to counterflood, which basically means you shut all your watertight doors in the ship and you start pumping the water coming in into other compartments on the other side of the ship. Most military ships have this capability, and that enables the ship to sink in a level way, and it takes much longer to sink. And the battleships were so huge that even once the West Virginia came to rest on the bottom, a lot of its gun batteries were still above water, and they were actually able to still continue the fight, even though the ship was actually resting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The Tennessee and the Maryland escaped relatively unscathed. They're berthed on the inside of the Oklahoma and the West Virginia, so torpedoes really can't get to them. They suffer some bomb damage, but they handle it pretty well. The California was berthed down at the end by itself, and it was torpedoed and sunk. There is one ship that does manage to get underway. Its boilers produce enough steam that they can actually start turning their turbines and their propellers. And the Nevada does actually get underway, and they don't have their captain on board. It's the first officer who was on board, and he makes the decision as he's steaming. He realizes that second wave is coming in, and there's a very narrow channel, and they call it the channel actually, that leads into Pearl Harbor. And he was afraid that if he went into that channel and got sunk, that it would take them several weeks, if not months, to raise that battleship and get it out of there. And so rather than risk being sunk in the channel, the Nevada goes ahead and beaches herself, just runs aground up there to keep herself from being sunk in the channel and really bottling up Pearl Harbor. The Pennsylvania then, which was our actually most modern battleship, was in dry dock undergoing some routine maintenance. And because of that, they didn't know exactly where it was, so there weren't that many planes that focused on it. And it was able to put up enough of a defense, even in dry dock, that really only one bomb fell on it. So the Pennsylvania suffers the least damage of all the battleships at Pearl Harbor. So the battleships were really the target of the first wave. The second wave comes back and focuses really on repair facilities and the airplanes. 232 airplanes are destroyed. They've been parked in rows, and most of them are destroyed on the ground. The reason they were parked in compact rows is because the attack we were expecting, again, I said we were expecting an attack, just not this one. We were expecting sabotage, some kind of maybe commando units sneaking in. And so we parked all of our planes into compact rows to help guard them. Unfortunately, planes all parked in compact rows make excellent targets from the air. And so one bomb would destroy a whole group or a whole row of airplanes, and it really made it easy pickings for the Japanese. As far as casualties, the human price tag, the human toll, 3,581 total casualties. Of those, 2,403 are killed, and 1,178 are wounded. That does not include civilian casualties, although civilian casualties were much, 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 much lighter. Um, most of the casualties were military, but there were civilians on base as well. So absolutely massive casualties during the attack. There are, however, some good things that come about from this. One, the Japanese had planned actually to have a third wave, and the third wave's target was supposed to be our oil reserves, our fuel. We had 4.5 million barrels. That's 42 gallons a barrel. So for those of you who are quick at math, can figure that out. 4,500,000 barrels of oil stored at Pearl Harbor. If they had hit this, it was absolutely irreplaceable. All of our domestic oil production was really going to help keep Great Britain in the fight in Europe, and we really didn't have any to spare to send to the Pacific. If they had hit this oil reserve, our fleet would have not been able to sail. We would have had no gas. We would run out of gas, and that would have been the end of it. But as it was, they didn't. They saved that for the third wave. The third wave never came because what they really wanted to hit were our carriers. And as it so happened, our carriers were out. I think it was the Wasp was in dry dock back in San Diego. There were no dry docks big enough in Pearl Harbor to handle an aircraft carrier. I want to say it was the Yorktown was delivering planes to the Coral Sea, and I think it was the Lexington or the Enterprise, I can't remember which it is now, was delivering planes to Midway. So all of our carriers were out at this time. In fact, your conspiracy theorists will say, "Aha, we knew." And so because they didn't know where our carriers were, the commander of the Japanese task force decided rather than go ahead and risk that the carriers were in the area, because certainly we knew that the Japanese were there now. He went ahead and decided to rearm his planes for aerial combat and get out while he could. Because again, 6 carriers, that was really the Japanese fleet. That was everything they had. And he couldn't risk losing that. He couldn't risk losing the entire Japanese fleet, not knowing where our carriers were. But little did he realize he had nothing to worry about. There were no carriers anywhere. And so again, no carriers were sunk as a result of that. This does a couple things for us. One, the naval admirals at the time really believed that battleships were the main weapon that the Navy had. The carriers were new. We didn't really know how to use them. We weren't sure what they could do really well. So we put all of our best sailors on the battleships. Well, now that the battleships were all at the bottom of Pearl Harbor and not coming up for a while, well, we had all these good sailors. Well, now we had to go put them somewhere else. And we put them on the carriers. And that forces us to go ahead and use the carrier tactics that really prove to be decisive. That's what really wins the war for us, using our aircraft carriers. And so we do actually get some benefits out of the attack on Pearl Harbor.